So with this, I will like to introduce the next speaker. The first speaker here is Cecilia Edström. She, as the Chief Financial Officer at Bactiguard, she is a member of the executive management team and responsible for business development. Over the past 3 years, she has managed the company's expansion in the Indian market. So over to Cecilia Edström.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal, and also to Dr. Singh for making it possible for me to participate in this. So if we go to the first slide, which is a copy of The Economist from I believe it's a May or June edition from 2014, which is showing the fact that doctors are increasingly facing antibiotic resistance, which means that they cannot treat infections which they have been able to treat since Fleming introduced antibiotics in the 1940s. And this is becoming an increasing problem to treat very common infections like pneumonia, appendicitis, urinary tract infections, and etc. We can go to the next slide, which is showing antimicrobial resistance across the world. Today, about 700,000 people are expected to die from infections which cannot be treated by infections. And by 2050, if we don't change this trend, as many as 10 million people may be at risk from dying of infections which cannot be treated. This is more than kills cancer every year globally. And the countries which are most exposed to this are India and China in Asia because of the high consumption of antibiotics. We move to the next slide. There is statistics from the WHO that about 1 in every 10 patients are affected by healthcare associations worldwide. But what they also say is that a large proportion of these infections are possible to avoid if you introduce effective preventive measures. Moving on to the next slide, which is showing the status in India, although statistics is very difficult to come across. You could see that in the Western world, healthcare-associated infections is the third highest cause of death, following cardiovascular disease and cancer. In India, the statistics are hard to come by, but we know that it's the single largest antibiotics consuming country in the world, and that at least 2 million people or patients are affected by hospital-acquired infections every year, most of those in the ICUs. And also many parents are experiencing that their babies die in prenatal and natal care from organisms which are resistant to normal antibiotics. Moving on to the next slides, you could see what the challenge is. Well, according to the WHO, preventing healthcare-associated infections has never been more important than it is today because of the antibiotic resistance. So infection prevention and control, if you introduce those actions, they can save millions of lives every year. Moving on to the next slide, this is what Bactiguard is all about. Our vision is that we will be able, at some point in the future, be able to eliminate healthcare-associated infections to, most importantly, save the lives of patients, but also free up capacity in the hospital. And as Dr. Agarwal said, accessibility to healthcare is of paramount importance. If we can free up bed capacity, then more patients can get care. And if we reduce the number of infections, we can also reduce the use of antibiotics and prevent the spread of multi-resistant bacteria. We move on to slide number 8. you could see that the most common areas of the body where hospital-acquired infections occur are the urinary tract, the bloodstream, and the respiratory tract. And you could also see that the causes of sepsis, which is effectively the body's response to an infection which damages its own tissue and organs, is the urinary tract infections, pneumonia, and the use of catheters. And that's why Bactiguard has developed products that prevent infections in those areas of the body, the urinary tract, the respiratory tract, and the bloodstream. Moving on to page number 9, what actually causes infections in the body related to catheters? Well, by bacteria entering through the medical device and adhering to the surface of the device and creating a biofilm, which can then be dispersed into the body and create infections. What Bactiguard is that we provide a surface to medical devices that prevents bacteria from adhering and creating biofilm. So you can see at the bottom of the page through an electron microscope, on the left side is an uncoated surface, and to the right a coated surface where much fewer bacteria adhere. Moving on to the next slide, just a few words on the technology, what it does and what it doesn't do. It consists of 3 noble metals, very thin layer, which doesn't alter the characteristics of the underlying device. But when these devices are introduced into the body, the different electropotentials of the metals create a microcurrent. So it becomes uncomfortable for the bacteria to stick to the surface, reproduce, and create biofilm. It's not releasing, so therefore it's not harmful for good bacteria or the patient's tissues. So you could say it's both effective and safe. So where should it be applied? If we move on to the next slide, you could see that on average, if the 1 in every 10 patients gets an infection in a hospital, 1 in every 1/3 of patients, or maybe as many as 60 to 90% of the patients in an ICU will acquire an infection. And these patients are already exposed because they're seriously ill and immunosuppressed. So the mortality rates are very high, between 25 to 50% if you acquire an infection in the ICU. It's also very costly for the hospitals to treat these infections, and it increases the average length of stay by almost a month. So therefore it reduces capacity. So what's the price of these catheter? Is it very costly? Well, I think you should, if we move to the next slide, look at the total cost of treatment. And this is where innovation has an uphill struggle, that innovative products may be a little bit more expensive than standard products. But if you look at the total cost of care, it reduces it dramatically because of the shorter length of stay, because of that you don't have to introduce additional therapies, and therefore can actually reduce your costs in total. Actually, I skipped one slide. If we can go back to one, to look at why Bactiguard should be standard in every ICU. It's because patients are exposed in all 3 areas, bloodstream, respiratory tract, and urinary tract. And we have products that actually address the problems in each area. They are all approved and available in India since the beginning of this year. And We have access to several of the main hospitals. Currently, we are some of the big ones where we are present at are Medanta and RML in Delhi and Sri Gangaram also in Delhi. We are concluding clinical trials, including 1,000 patients at 5 different locations across India, which we will be publishing in the autumn with very good results. So I think we will be able to meet several of you when we visit India later this year and conduct seminars across the country. And just to conclude, on the last slide, page 14, preventing infections has never been more important than it is today because of the rising antimicrobial resistance. So in order to protect the patients, we need to reduce infections. The problem should be addressed at the source. Prevention, hygiene routines, training of staff, and the use of innovative solutions. And in order to be able to introduce innovative and preventive actions, one needs to focus on the total cost of treatment, but also introduce quality criteria in tenders and direct purchases, because if there's only a competition on price, innovative technologies will never make it. And also develop new guidelines for hospital staff, clinicians, on how to introduce hygiene guidelines, how to use new technology, and how to engage in continuous development. And last but not least, use the clinical evidence that is available from other markets and data, clinical data as a reference when you introduce new technology. With that, I would like to hand back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cecilia. And for the wonderful presentation, I think to highlight the importance of hospital-associated infections and the rising antimicrobial resistance in a big, big way. We'll be very happy to take any questions from the participants. And even while the next speaker is on, you can send your questions. So maybe even at the end of if there is any question right away, otherwise what we'll do is we'll go on with the next speaker, and please keep sending your questions so that we'll take it at the end of these two speakers.